And now coming up next is Bad Hair Day. The overall story is okay, even though it does suffer from a lot of flaws. So Tim Swanson, he loves magic tricks, and he goes to his idol's show, Amazo the Magician. Amazo turns out that he's a complete jerk for some unknown reason, at least at this point unknown. And so to get him back, Tim steals Amazo's bag of tricks, and then he unleashes red balls that just multiply endlessly, and they're filling up the room, and they're being super scary, I guess. And then he finds snakes that are hissing at him and being real threatening. And then he eventually turns his sister into a rabbit by accident. And then he has to take his sister back to Amazo to get her back as a person. And then he goes and he finds that Amazo is actually the rabbit on the cover of the book. He's not, well, he is a magician, but he's a rabbit who works a dummy like a puppet, I guess. The twist ending isn't too bad when Tim wants to join Amazo's act, and Amazo turns him into a rabbit, and then Tim gets to join Amazo's act forevermore as the rabbit. This book wasn't so much bad as it was just uninteresting. It wasn't completely devoid of enjoyable moments or even scary dark moments, but nothing really happens to get one interested or invested in reading about those moments. It's not a bad read, just not a good one. And now we have Why I'm Afraid of Bees. So Gary Lutz is kind of an average kid. He plays on his computer all the time, doesn't have many friends or anything, and he figures that he would be better as somebody else. He wishes that he could be somebody else. And then while he's on his computer, he finds this place that specializes in switching people's bodies, switching people's minds. And he goes to this place and he switches bodies with another kid that said, "Oh, I'd love to be that kid." They agree, they come over to his house, they switch him, except he does not end up in the other kid's body. The other kid's name is Dirk. Gary ends up in the body of a bee because there was an accident. A bee flew into the machine and switched him with the bee. Dirk is now in Gary's body, and the bee is now in Dirk's body. So Dirk's body is going wild like a bee. Dirk in Gary's body is living it up. He's popular, everything. And Gary, as a bee, it's kind of flat. This is kind of a likable story in and of itself, but it has, again, almost no suspense or scariness to it. And I would hate to judge a book like this, especially considering that it's a children's book, but so many of the events described in the book, from both realistic and now even a legal standpoint, are just impossible. The whole process that this book revolves around is illegal. Like parental consent thrown out the window, and he's a Goosebumps protagonist, so he's 12 years old. Fun fact for you, very few of the Goosebumps protagonists are not 12. But him being a 12-year-old going to this place that's going to do something extremely shady. He's going to switch his mind with another boy's mind and have them switch places, again, without parental consent. And if you don't mind such things, then this might be a good read for you. But it just prevented me from fully suspending my disbelief on this book. It had some slow moments, it had some well-paced moments, but it was, again, just kind of monotonous, and it really failed as a horror story. And now next is Egg Monsters from Mars. The plot is, yes, Dana goes on an egg hunt, finds this giant egg, it hatches, and then he's got this egg monster. He goes to take it to a scientist to examine it, and turns out the scientist is evil. So Dr. Gray, that scientist, he locks up Dana, and He's locked in there with all these egg monsters for, I don't know how long it was until he was let out, maybe a day or two, and he's just stuck there. His parents don't know where he is, and eventually gets out, and then he lives happily ever after. Maybe, not really, possibly. Again, the twist ending is pretty ambiguous, I think. I'm just going to start off by saying this book gets the W.T. Heck Award for the weirdest twist ending that I've come across in a Goosebumps book, especially in the original series. That, however, is not the main reason why this book is ranked as low as it is. The egg monsters that the book centers around are not really scary at all, and as a matter of fact, they're the good guys. Apart from a sentence or two, they are always wanting to help Dana. Is it Dana or Dana? He's a boy, which is a weird name for a boy, whether it's Dana or Dana. Now, the twist ending does put a little ambiguity on if the egg monsters are good guys or if they're bad guys. At least, that's the way that I interpreted it. There's not a whole lot to this story. Not much else to say about it. It can be interesting, or it can't be. Now next is Deep Trouble 2. So Billy and Sheena are with Dr. D again, and they are on his boat, and they realize that, some of the sea life is getting really huge. I think the first example of it is a minnow, a normally tiny, tiny fish, and they've got one that's just huge. And then they see like a snail and other big animals. They find out that there's another scientist. His name is Dr. Ritter, and he developed a plankton. He modified a plankton that when sea animals eat it, they grow to thousands of times their normal size. And he's doing this because he thinks it's going to end world hunger. So he's got noble intentions, sure. So Dr. Ritter is paranoid that Dr. D, Billy, and Sheena are going to steal his secret, and he's just kind of going to fall by the wayside. And he doesn't want to let that happen. So he goes completely nuts. Like, completely nuts. He tries to get Billy to, eat some of the plankton, because he says that when a human eats this plankton, they will turn into a fish. And so then that kind of brings up an interesting and yet still disappointing aspect of the story. Fish eat it, they grow big. People eat it, they turn into fish. And that's just how the book works. The climax of the book, he tries to get Billy to eat it. Billy eats it, and nothing happens. Because we find out that he switched the cans, several chapters ago. And then Dr. Ritter, desperate to prove what it can do, and being just a mad scientist, he grabs the plant, he eats it, turns into a fish, and swims away. And then you get Sheena, poor Sheena, she grabs a bottle, and then she drinks it, and then they're like, wait a second, was that the plankton or no? And so that's the end of the book. I think this book made a valiant effort to be scary and suspenseful, but it just didn't work out that well. The concept is quite interesting. The build-up is good. The climax isn't too bad. And the twist ending is somewhat likable. But it has definite downfalls. I found this book a little bit hard to be truly engaged in while reading it. It is a little bit slow to get started, but afterwards the pacing, again, is not too bad. But it's just a little bit boring. A little bit boring. So it has good points. It has bad points. I didn't particularly care for it. And now next up we have The Blob That Ate Everyone. So Zachy likes to write monster stories about a blob that destroys the town. So he and his friend Alex are walking along the road one night. They come across this antique store that's burned down. They go in, see a typewriter, and Zachy just falls in love with this typewriter. He really wants it. He goes over, touches it, and then there's like this blue like lightning that kind of envelops his body. And turns out that when he touched the typewriter, that he actually got like the power to make stories come true. So it's not the typewriter that is doing it. So they take it home. He starts to write his story, and then everything is coming true. He writes like it's a dark and stormy night. Suddenly it's dark outside and stormy. And then Alex is like, "Hey, what you're writing is coming true." And they say, "Let's test it." He said, "There's a knock at the door." He writes, "There's a knock and there's a knock on the door." He goes back and he opens the door. No one's there. And then he said, "Well, you didn't write anybody at the door." Okay, Adam was at the door. He goes back, and then Adam is at the door. And this kind of, while the reader is still thinking it's about the typewriter, they see Adam comes in. He types a sentence on the story like the blob monster was waiting downstairs. And so then Zachy and Alex, they go downstairs. And you're expecting a blob monster to be there. No, because again, the power is not in the typewriter. The power is in Zachy. And so that kind of leads to a disappointing climax where the blob monster has eaten everyone, because eventually he does write about the blob monster. He's like, "Oh, this is all just coincidence." He writes his story. Blob monster comes to life, starts eating everybody, and then he has to go home where Alex is waiting for him. And then Alex, she's just freaking out because, there's a blob monster there, of course. Zachy, he loses his typewriter. The blob eats his typewriter and he says, "Oh no." But then he thinks, wait a second, if Adam wrote that sentence and it didn't come true, maybe the power is in me, which of course it is. And so he thinks the blob monster away. And that's the climax of the book. The monster just gone. And then the twist ending comes along, and this twist ending, it also pretty well ruins the rest of the book. But it destroyed less, I think. It wasn't such a good book that to invalidate it is a sin. It was kind of a mediocre book, and then the twist ending happened, and it's like, well, okay, at least you weren't destroying something awesome. And so it kind of failed, because the twist ending is that it turns out that a blob monster was actually writing about Zachy, who was writing about the blob monsters. And so a blob monster turns to his friend and is like, "Hey, what do you think of my story? It's about a kid who's writing about the blob that ate everyone." It's just kind of weird. The pacing was pretty good. It had quite an engaging series of events up until the climax. But again, this book is just a giant fake-out scare. I think this book deserved a much better ending, but unfortunately didn't get it.